Pack your things and get out of our lives. The message appeared on my phone. It was sent from my husband's number, Charles Thompson, 70 years old, and in that moment, I almost laughed. The message came from my husband's phone, but the cold, calculated wording didn't belong to him. It belonged to his young mistress, Vanessa. Another woman might have called her husband immediately, or cried, or panicked, but I didn't. Instead, I opened my phone and began canceling every payment that had been funding his life. Just a few minutes later, a fraud alert from the bank appeared on my screen. And what I saw in that notification made me realize this situation was far worse than a simple breakup text. My name is Ruth Thompson. I am 68 years old. I spent 35 years working as a forensic accountant. And what my husband and his young mistress didn't know was that for more than 30 years, my job has been tracking people who think they can steal money and get away with it. If you're listening to this right now and you feel even a little sympathy for what I just experienced, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people hear stories like this. And I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment with your city or country. You might discover someone very close to you is watching this story at the same time. Now let me tell you what really happened that night. For a long moment after that message arrived, I sat quietly in my office chair staring at the screen. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers of downtown Chicago. Cars crawled slowly through traffic on Michigan Avenue. The steady movement of the city felt strangely calming. Life continues, no matter what happens inside your own home. And at that moment, I understood something very clearly. The message on my phone wasn't the beginning of my marriage falling apart. It was simply the moment the truth finally revealed itself. Because the real ending had started 2 nights earlier. That night, I had been sitting in the living room of our suburban house just outside the city. The television was on low volume, the kind of background noise you keep when you're waiting for someone to come home. It was already past midnight. My husband had said he was meeting a friend for drinks. That had become a common explanation lately. Drinks, meetings, late nights. At 70 years old, the man had suddenly discovered a social life that required more nightlife than most people half his age. The sound of the front door finally opening echoed through the quiet house. I remember glancing at the clock. 12:47 a.m. When he walked into the living room, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Whiskey, strong enough to fill the room. The second thing I noticed was the lipstick, a bright smear of red on the collar of his white shirt. I didn't say anything for several seconds. After 43 years of marriage, you develop a strange habit of observing before reacting. He saw me sitting on the couch and froze for a moment. Then he tried to smile. Still awake? His voice was slurred slightly. I stood slowly. "You've been drinking." He shrugged carelessly and tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter. "Just a couple with friends." I stepped closer. The lipstick stain was impossible to miss now. Bright red against white fabric. "Your friends wear lipstick now." The smile vanished. Immediately, his face hardened in a way I hadn't seen before. "You always do this," he snapped, always looking for something to complain about. "I'm looking at it," I said quietly, pointing to the collar. "That's not mine." For a moment he said nothing. Then the denial came. Probably from a hug goodbye. You know how people are. 43 years of marriage. And that was the explanation he chose. I shook my head slowly. "You think I'm stupid?" That was when the anger came. Sudden, explosive. "Here we go again," he shouted. "You and your accusations." "I'm not accusing you of anything," I said. "I'm looking at your shirt." He stepped closer, his breath heavy with alcohol. "You've always been jealous," he said, "always suspicious." Jealous. The word hung in the air like a bad joke. I had spent the last decade funding his retirement, paying the mortgage, paying the car, paying the bills, and somehow I was the jealous one. "I just want the truth," I said. That was when he shoved me. It wasn't a dramatic attack, just a sudden, careless push. But at 68 years old, balance isn't what it used to be. My heel caught the edge of the rug. I fell sideways and struck the corner of the coffee table. For a moment, the room spun. Warm liquid slid down the side of my forehead. Blood. I sat on the floor, stunned more by the moment itself than the pain. He looked down at me, not with concern, not with regret, just annoyance. "See what you made me do?" he muttered. That was the moment something inside me quietly shut down. Not anger, not grief, just clarity. I stood up slowly, pressed a napkin to the small cut on my forehead, and walked to the bathroom without another word. When I returned, he was already asleep in the bedroom. The smell of whiskey still lingered in the hallway. I spent the rest of the night sitting alone at the kitchen table, not crying, not yelling, just thinking. Because after 35 years investigating financial crimes, I understood something about people who cross a line. Once someone believes they can get away with something, they usually try something bigger next. 2 days later, that message arrived on my phone. Pack your things and get out of our lives. I leaned back in my office chair and folded my hands. The office was quiet now. Most of my colleagues had already gone home. For a few seconds, I considered calling my husband, not to argue, just to hear how he would explain letting someone else send that message. But some conversations aren't worth having. Instead, I unlocked my phone and opened my banking application. My husband had always believed our finances were simple. Money came in. Bills got paid. Life continued. What he never bothered to understand was how carefully those systems were arranged. Mortgage payments scheduled automatically. Vehicle lease payments drafted monthly. Insurance policies tied directly to my accounts. Luxury, when you think about it, is really just a long chain of automatic payments. And chains can be broken. One by one, I began canceling them. The car lease, the insurance policy, the recurring household payments. Each cancellation took only a few seconds. No arguments, no shouting, just quiet decisions. When I finished, I set the phone down beside my keyboard. That was when it vibrated again. A sharp notification from the bank. Fraud alert. I opened the message and read it slowly. An outgoing wire transfer request. $50,000. Initiated from our joint savings account. The login credentials belonged to my husband. For a few seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Then I felt something I hadn't felt all day. Professional curiosity. Because if there is one thing I understand better than almost anyone, it's what happens when someone tries to move money and they don't understand. I opened the transaction details and studied the routing information. And as the numbers appeared on the screen, a quiet realization settled in my mind. This situation was no longer about a cheating husband. It was about something far bigger and far more dangerous. I picked up the phone and dialed my bank's fraud department. Because after 35 years tracking financial crimes, I knew exactly what kind of story those numbers were about to tell. The moment the fraud alert appeared on my phone, I didn't panic. Panic is what ordinary people do when they see money disappearing. I investigate the people who cause that panic. I picked up the phone and dialed the direct number for the bank's fraud division. After decades of dealing with financial institutions, you learn that there are two kinds of phone numbers, the ones customers use and the ones professionals use. I had the second kind. The line rang once. Fraud Investigations Department. This is Daniel speaking. Daniel, this is Ruth Thompson. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, Mrs. Thompson. Good afternoon. My work occasionally intersected with banks when companies hired me to investigate internal theft cases. That meant the people in fraud departments usually knew my name before I even finished introducing myself. I just received a fraud alert regarding a wire transfer from my joint savings account, I said calmly. $50,000. I could hear the rapid clicking of a keyboard. Yes, I'm looking at the account now, Daniel replied. The transaction was initiated approximately 8 minutes ago. Has it cleared yet? No. It's currently in pending review. Good. Large transfers often triggered internal security delays. That delay was about to save my husband from making an even bigger mistake. Cancel it, I said. Another pause. Do you believe the transaction is unauthorized? I know it is, I replied. He didn't argue. After a few seconds, he spoke again. The transfer has been halted. Funds will remain frozen until we complete an internal investigation. Lock the account as well, I added. Remove all online access except mine. That can be done. And send me the routing details for the destination account. That request caused a longer silence. Normally, banks avoid sharing too much information about receiving accounts, but there are exceptions. Especially when the person asking the question has spent 35 years testifying in fraud cases. Give me a moment, he said. I leaned back in my office chair and looked out the window again. Chicago was beginning to glow in the soft orange light of early evening. The lake in the distance looked almost silver beneath the setting sun. In another life, this might have been the moment when someone breaks down. The moment when a woman realizes her husband is not only cheating, but also stealing. But my mind wasn't thinking about heartbreak. It was analyzing numbers. The line clicked again. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm here. The destination account belongs to a business entity called Apex Digital Assets." The name sounded vaguely familiar. "Primary account holder?" I asked. "Jamal Carter." That name I recognized immediately. I closed my eyes for a moment and slowly exhaled. Of course it was him. Jamal Carter had married my husband's niece 3 years ago. At family gatherings, he liked to talk loudly about cryptocurrency markets and digital investments. He drove expensive cars, wore tailored suits, and constantly referred to himself as a financial visionary. In my experience, anyone who calls themselves a visionary is usually about 2 steps away from a criminal investigation. "Daniel," I said quietly, "do me a favor and keep that transfer permanently blocked." "It's already flagged," he replied. "The money won't move without your authorization." "Good. Would you like us to report the attempted transfer as fraud?" "Not yet." I ended the call and placed the phone on my desk. For a moment I simply sat there thinking, because something about the situation didn't add up. If my husband was simply trying to impress a younger woman, $50,000 seemed like an oddly specific amount to move. Large enough to matter, small enough to move quietly, which meant there was a very good chance this wasn't just a personal decision. It might be part of something else entirely. I turned my computer monitor toward me and began searching public financial records, corporate registries, licensing databases, investment disclosures. After 35 years in forensic accounting, there are very few places money can hide where I don't know how to look. Within 15 minutes, I found Apex Digital Assets, and what I saw made me sit up straighter in my chair. The company was registered only 18 months earlier. No clear financial disclosures, no investment licenses, and buried inside a federal regulatory database was a short notation that immediately caught my attention. SEC inquiry pending. I felt a slow smile spread across my face. The Securities and Exchange Commission doesn't investigate legitimate companies for entertainment. If Apex Digital Assets was already on their radar, then Jamal Carter wasn't just a flashy businessman. He was a man standing dangerously close to federal charges, which meant my husband had just attempted to wire $50,000 into the middle of a potential financial crime. I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip. Across the office, the cleaning staff had begun moving quietly through the hallway. The faint scent of lemon disinfectant drifted through the air. It was almost peaceful. And yet, somewhere in the suburbs, my 70-year-old husband was probably celebrating, imagining that he had successfully moved a large sum of money, imagining that he and his young mistress were about to begin a new life, funded by my savings. The irony of the situation was almost amusing, because while he was celebrating, I was investigating. I opened another browser tab and pulled up property records. Then, vehicle registration data. Then, insurance coverage. One by one, I reviewed every financial structure connected to our household. People often assume revenge is loud, that it involves screaming, accusations, dramatic confrontations. But in my experience, real consequences arrive quietly, through paperwork, through contracts, through the slow realization that the money you depended on is no longer available. By the time the office lights dimmed for the evening, I had already mapped out the first stage of what would happen next. The house, the car, the insurance, every single piece of the comfortable life my husband believed belonged to him. And for the first time in 2 days, I felt something close to calm. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just the quiet certainty that comes from understanding a situation clearly. Because when someone tries to steal from a forensic accountant, they rarely understand one simple truth. We don't react emotionally. We follow the evidence. And the evidence was beginning to point somewhere very interesting. I shut down my computer, picked up my coat, and walked toward the elevator. The city outside was glowing now, streetlights reflecting off the lake like a ribbon of gold. Somewhere across town, my husband and his young mistress were probably raising glasses of champagne, celebrating a victory that didn't actually exist. They just didn't know it yet. By the time I reached the parking garage beneath the office building, the night air in Chicago had turned sharp and cold. November has a way of creeping into the bones, especially after sunset, and I pulled my coat tighter as I walked toward my car. For a moment, I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The city skyline shimmered in the rearview mirror. Lights from office towers reflected across the lake like scattered stars. 40 years ago, when I first started my career, I used to look at those buildings and wonder if I would ever belong inside them. Now one of those offices had my name on the door, and the man who had just tried to steal $50,000 from me had never once bothered to understand how I earned that place. I started the car and pulled out of the garage. The drive to our suburban house usually took about 40 minutes. Traffic was lighter than usual, which meant I had time to think. When you spend decades investigating financial fraud, your mind begins organizing problems automatically. Patterns, timelines, motives. The attempted wire transfer had already revealed 3 things. First, my husband believed the money belonged to him. Second, Jamal Carter was involved. And third, Vanessa had convinced a 70-year-old man that destroying his marriage was a brilliant idea. It would have been almost funny if it weren't so predictable. The closer I got to the suburbs, the quieter the roads became. City lights gave way to long residential streets lined with leafless trees and tidy front lawns. The neighborhood had always looked peaceful from the outside. That illusion ended the moment I turned into our driveway. Another car sat parked beside the Mercedes, a dark blue BMW. I recognized it immediately. Jamal Carter loved that car. He talked about it constantly at family gatherings, explaining how crypto investments had paid for it. Except the car wasn't actually his. A quick search months earlier had shown it was leased under a company account. People who pretend to be rich often make the same mistake. They think the appearance of wealth is the same thing as owning it. The lights inside the house were on, and as I stepped onto the front porch, I heard laughter drifting through the door. Loud laughter. Celebration. I opened the door quietly and stepped inside. The smell of champagne hit me first, then music. Some jazz playlist playing through the living room speakers. My husband stood near the kitchen island holding a glass of champagne, looking years younger than he had in months. Vanessa leaned against the counter beside him wearing a black dress that looked like it had been designed to make sure everyone noticed her. Across from them, Jamal Carter was gesturing dramatically with his hands while explaining something that sounded suspiciously like a financial fantasy. "I'm telling you, Charles," he said loudly, "crypto liquidity pools are the future of decentralized finance." My husband raised his glass. "To the future." Vanessa laughed and clinked her glass against his. "That transfer you sent earlier," Jamal continued confidently, "I've already allocated it into the pool. Once the cycle closes, we're looking at least a 300 to 100% return. 300%. I nearly smiled. The funny thing about Ponzi schemes is that they always promise impossible returns, and the people who believe them are always convinced they're about to become geniuses. My husband leaned back against the counter with a satisfied grin. "See?" he said to Vanessa. "I told you I had it handled." She slipped her arm through his and kissed his cheek. "You did amazing tonight." The room felt strangely quiet to me, despite the music and laughter. Not tense, just distant. Like watching a scene from a movie where the characters don't realize what's about to happen. None of them had noticed me standing in the doorway yet. For a few seconds, I simply observed them. The man I had spent 43 years married to, the young woman who believed she had just won some kind of competition, and the self-proclaimed crypto millionaire explaining how imaginary profits were about to change their lives. Then I stepped forward. The sound of my heels against the hardwood floor made them all turn at once. The laughter stopped instantly. Vanessa blinked in surprise. My husband's smile disappeared. "Well," he said slowly, "look who decided to come home." Jamal shifted uncomfortably and straightened his jacket. Vanessa crossed her arms. "I thought we were very clear about the message," she said coldly. I ignored her completely. Instead, I looked directly at my husband. "You tried to sell my father's watch," I said calmly. The room went quiet again. For a split second, his eyes flickered with something close to guilt. Then the defensiveness returned. "I needed cash," he said sharply, "and you've been controlling the finances for years." "Controlling?" I repeated. "You treat me like a child," he snapped. "Everything has to go through you." Vanessa placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to explain yourself to her, she said softly. I finally turned toward her. You must be Vanessa. She lifted her chin. Yes, the one sending messages from my husband's phone. She didn't deny it. Instead, she smiled in a way that suggested she believed she had already won. He deserved the courage to say it, she replied. My husband cleared his throat and stepped forward. You heard the message, he said. This marriage is over. For a moment, I studied his face. 43 years. Birthdays, funerals, holidays. Every memory of a shared life sitting inside a man who now looked at me like a stranger. Then I nodded once. All right. That answer seemed to surprise him. No arguing? He asked. No begging? No. Vanessa frowned. You're just leaving? I looked around the house slowly. The living room furniture. The paintings on the walls. The quiet symbols of a life built over decades. Then I turned back to them. Actually, I said calmly, I came to pack a few things. Jamal chuckled nervously. Probably a good idea, he muttered. None of them understood what was actually happening yet. But they would. Soon enough. Because the house they were celebrating inside was never really theirs to begin with. For a few seconds after I said I came to pack my things, nobody spoke. The silence in the room felt thick, like the moment before a storm breaks. Jazz music still played softly from the speakers in the living room, but the cheerful sound now felt strangely out of place. My husband stared at me as if he were waiting for the argument he had prepared himself to win. Vanessa leaned against the kitchen counter with her arms crossed, watching me with the smug confidence of someone who believed the battle had already been decided. And Jamal Carter, standing beside his glass of champagne, suddenly looked far less comfortable than he had a few minutes earlier. Well, my husband said finally, his voice edged with irritation. I hope you're not planning to take anything that belongs to me. I looked at him calmly. Don't worry, I said. I'm only taking what's mine. Vanessa let out a quiet laugh. That shouldn't take very long. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked past them toward the hallway that led to the master bedroom. As I moved through the house, I became aware of how familiar everything felt. The framed photographs along the wall, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint scent of the lavender candle I had lit earlier that week. 43 years of marriage leaves traces everywhere. Memories live inside furniture, inside pictures, inside the way sunlight falls across the floor in the afternoon. But memories are strange things. They can disappear the moment you realize the person standing beside you no longer belongs to them. When I entered the bedroom, I closed the door behind me and stood still for a moment. The bed was unmade. My husband's jacket hung over the back of a chair, and on the dresser sat the empty velvet box where my father's watch had once been kept. I walked slowly across the room and picked up the box. The inside lining was worn from years of use. For decades, that watch had been the one object I never worried about losing. It had always felt safe in this house. Until 2 nights ago, the memory returned clearly. The phone call from the auction house. The polite voice of the man on the line asking me to confirm the sale. The moment I realized my husband had carried that watch into a store and attempted to exchange it for cash, not to pay a bill, not to cover an emergency, but to impress a woman young enough to be his granddaughter, I closed the box and placed it carefully into my suitcase. Then I opened the closet and removed a small stack of documents from the safe. My passport, personal records, a portable hard drive containing years of financial files. These were the things that actually mattered. Clothes could be replaced, furniture could be replaced, but identity and evidence were far more valuable. When I stepped back into the hallway a few minutes later, the conversation in the living room had grown louder again. Jamal's voice drifted toward me as I approached. Once the crypto cycle closes, he was saying confidently, the liquidity payout is going to triple the original investment. Vanessa sounded impressed. That fast? That's the beauty of decentralized finance, he replied. I stepped into the room again just in time to see my husband nodding enthusiastically. You see, he said to her, I told you we were going to be fine. Jamal lifted his glass again. To smart investments. I walked toward the front door with my suitcase. None of them noticed me immediately. They were too busy celebrating money that didn't actually exist. Finally, Vanessa looked up and saw me crossing the room. Already leaving? She asked. Yes. She tilted her head slightly. That was quicker than I expected. I don't need much. My husband stepped closer. Before you go, he said, you should understand something. I waited. "You can't just cut me off financially," he continued. "Half of everything in this marriage belongs to me." For the first time that evening, I smiled, not mockingly, just politely. "That's something your lawyer can explain to you later." His eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said calmly, "you should probably get some rest tonight." Vanessa frowned. "You sound very confident for someone who just got thrown out of her own house." I looked at her for a moment. Then I turned my attention back to my husband. "You tried to sell my father's watch." He shifted uncomfortably. "I told you," he muttered. "I needed the money." "No," I replied softly. "You wanted the money." The difference seemed to irritate him. "Oh, please," he snapped. "You're acting like it was some priceless museum artifact." I held his gaze. "It was priceless to me." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I picked up my suitcase again. Vanessa moved closer to him, slipping her arm through his. "You should let her go," she said quietly. "She's just trying to make you feel guilty." My husband nodded slowly. "You're right." He looked at me one last time. "Goodbye, Ruth." The finality in his voice would have sounded dramatic to someone who didn't know him. But I had spent 43 years learning the difference between drama and reality. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a chain reaction he hadn't even started to understand yet. I walked out the front door without another word. The night air outside was colder now, and the quiet suburban street looked almost peaceful under the glow of streetlights. I placed my suitcase in the back seat of my car and stood there for a moment. Inside the house, laughter erupted again. Jamal must have been telling another story about cryptocurrency profits. I sat behind the wheel and started the engine. As I pulled away from the curb, the house disappeared slowly in the rearview mirror. For a long time, I had believed that house represented stability, security, a lifetime of shared effort. Now I understood what it really was. An illusion. And illusions have a habit of collapsing when the person funding them decides to stop. I drove toward the city lights, already knowing exactly what the next morning would bring. Because while my husband and his friends were celebrating imaginary wealth, I was preparing something much more real: consequences. I checked into a hotel in downtown Chicago just after 9 that night. Not one of those glittering places tourists photograph for social media, but a quiet old hotel near the river with polished brass elevators, fresh white sheets, and staff who understood the value of discretion. The woman at the front desk recognized me from prior stays during late audit seasons and greeted me with the kind of professional warmth older women notice and appreciate. "Good evening, Mrs. Thompson." "Checking in for one?" "Yes," I said. She glanced at my suitcase, then back at my face, and whatever she saw there made her keep her questions to herself. "That will be room 1418. "Thank you." When the elevator doors closed, I finally let myself exhale. The silence inside that hotel room felt different from the silence in my house. It wasn't empty, it was clean, safe, untangled from the smell of whiskey and lipstick and betrayal. I set my suitcase on the luggage rack, slipped off my shoes, and walked straight to the bathroom mirror. The cut on my forehead had mostly stopped bleeding, but the skin around it was beginning to darken into a bruise. I touched it gently with 2 fingers. For a moment I saw my father's face in my memory. Not because he had ever laid a hand on my mother, he never did, but because he had always said the same thing whenever he saw a woman swallow pain in silence. "Dignity is not something people give you, baby girl. It's something you keep." I washed my face, applied a fresh bandage, and returned to the desk by the window. Then I opened my laptop. There are some women who respond to heartbreak by calling friends, pouring wine, and crying until sunrise. No judgment from me. Grief comes in different forms. Mine has always arrived as paperwork. By 10 o'clock, I had already emailed the property management company that handled the house. 3 years earlier, when foreclosure nearly swallowed the place whole, I had stepped in quietly and purchased the property through a private trust. Not because I was trying to deceive anyone, because I understood risk. At the time, my husband had been too embarrassed to admit how bad things were and too proud to let me save him openly, so I let him keep his pride. I handled the transaction privately, set up the trust, and hired a management company to administer it. The monthly mortgage equivalent payments, insurance, and maintenance were all funded through my accounts. He never asked enough questions to understand the difference between living in a home and owning it. That had always been his weakness. He loved comfort, But he had no curiosity about what made comfort possible. My email to the property manager was brief and direct. Effective immediately, I was terminating all voluntary payment arrangements on behalf of the current occupants. I also requested that a formal 3-day notice be prepared in accordance with Illinois law. No emotion, no explanation, just instructions. Then I opened a second file and drafted a message to the auto leasing company. The silver Mercedes parked in that driveway had never belonged to my husband. It had been leased under a holding company attached to the same trust structure. I was the sole authorized signatory. The insurance policy was tied to my personal umbrella coverage, which meant one very simple thing. The moment I withdrew that coverage, the car became an unacceptable liability. And liability is something people in my profession do not tolerate. I requested immediate repossession. The beauty of contracts is that they don't care about feelings. At 10:30, I closed the laptop, ordered a pot of black coffee from room service, and sat by the window watching the city lights ripple across the dark water. There should have been sadness in me. Perhaps there was, somewhere underneath everything else. But what I felt most strongly was relief. Not because my marriage had ended. That loss was old already. It had been dying quietly for months, maybe years. The relief came from no longer having to pretend, no longer having to smooth over disrespect at family dinners, no longer hearing lies and acting as though I believed them, no longer tolerating a man who came home smelling like another woman and then shoved me hard enough to draw blood. When you cross 65, a curious thing happens. The world begins to assume you have become soft, harmless, easy to dismiss. But age does not always weaken a woman. Sometimes it clarifies her. I slept deeply that night for the first time in weeks. At 6:10 the next morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I was already awake. The city outside the window was gray and cold, the kind of Chicago morning that makes steam rise from manhole covers and turns the river the color of steel. The caller ID showed my husband's number. I let it ring 4 times before answering. I put the call on speaker and took a slow sip of coffee. What? At first, all I heard was breathing. Then came a woman's voice, shrill, furious, young enough to think volume could replace authority. Where is the car, Vanessa? So he was letting her make his calls now too. I leaned back in the desk chair and crossed one leg over the other. Good morning to you too. Don't play games with me, she snapped. The Mercedes is gone. There are tire marks in the driveway, and the neighbor said a tow truck came at 3 in the morning. The repossession company had been prompt. I appreciated that. I see, I said calmly. You had it taken, didn't you? Yes. There was a stunned silence on the line, brief but satisfying. You can't do that. I already did. That car is his. No, I said gently. It isn't. In the background, I heard my husband muttering something, then the muffled sound of the phone changing hands. His voice came through next, rough with sleep and rising panic. Have you lost your mind? No. You had my car stolen. It wasn't your car. It was in my driveway. That does not make it yours. Another silence. Then, anger, hot and childish. You vindictive old woman. The phrase might have hurt once. That morning it only made me smile. Careful, I said. You're speaking to the person who has been paying for your lifestyle. You can't just pull the rug out from under me. No, I replied. Actually, I can. His breathing grew louder. There is a particular sound a person makes when entitlement collides with reality. I had heard it in conference rooms, courtrooms, and executive offices for 35 years. Men who spent a lifetime mistaking dependency for power always make the same sound when they realize the flow of money has stopped. Listen to me, he said, trying to steady his voice. Whatever this is, we can work it out. Work it out. That phrase almost made me laugh. 43 years of marriage reduced to a repossessed car and a plea for negotiation. You sent me a message, I reminded him. Or rather, your mistress did. She told me to pack my things and get out of your lives. That was, he stopped himself, a small thing, but important, because truth often hides in the interruptions. That was what? I asked. Nothing. He had no answer. So I gave him one. You wanted me gone. This is what gone looks like. Then I ended the call. I set the phone on the desk and watched the screen go dark. Somewhere, out in the suburbs, my husband and his young mistress were standing in a driveway beside an empty space where their luxury car used to be, trying to explain humiliation to each other before breakfast. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt the balance of power begin to shift, because the car was only the first thing they lost. By 9 o'clock that morning, my husband had already called 3 more times. I didn't answer. There is a certain kind of man who mistakes access for power. As long as he can reach you, interrupt you, pull at your attention, he still believes he has control. Silence unsettles that kind of man more than any argument ever could. I finished my coffee, dressed carefully, and stood for a moment in front of the hotel mirror. The bruise at my forehead had deepened overnight, spreading faintly beneath the edge of the bandage. I touched it once, lightly, then lowered my hand. Last night, that mark had felt like humiliation. This morning, it felt like evidence. I chose a charcoal wool dress, low black heels, and a long tailored coat. Not because I intended to impress anyone, but because older women understand something younger women often learn too late. When your life is trying to come apart, routine becomes a form of dignity. I pinned on my small gold earrings, picked up my leather folder, and headed downstairs. The hotel restaurant smelled of toast, bacon, and fresh coffee. A retired couple sat by the window sharing a newspaper. 2 businessmen in navy suits were discussing flights to Dallas. Somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clinked in that familiar American breakfast rhythm. I ordered oatmeal, black coffee, and 1 soft-boiled egg. Then I opened my folder and reviewed the property documents. The suburban house had once been the source of a great deal of pride for my husband. He loved to stand in the driveway on summer evenings and speak about it as if he had built it with his own hands. He loved telling people about the good school district, the mature trees on the block, the investment value of owning in that neighborhood. What he never said, because he never fully understood it, was that the home had nearly been lost 3 years earlier. At the time, he had made a string of foolish financial decisions. A failed investment club with friends from the golf course. Credit cards used carelessly, money borrowed against retirement accounts. He had been humiliated and desperate, and like many proud men of his generation, he preferred illusion to confession. So I stepped in quietly. I arranged the purchase through a private trust. I funded the down payment. I hired a management company to administer the property. And because I still cared about preserving his pride back then, I let him continue telling people what he liked. Some women call that love. Looking back now, I think it was closer to mercy. After breakfast, I returned to my room and dialed the property management company. A crisp, capable woman answered on the second ring. Sterling Residential Management. This is Diane. Good morning, Diane. This is Ruth Thompson. Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. I was expecting your call. Of course she was. People in property management understand urgency. They hear it in the tone of a woman's voice, the same way a doctor hears trouble in a patient's breathing. I wanted to confirm the notice was prepared. It was, she said. It went out this morning. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Delivered already? Yes, ma'am. Affixed to the front entry at 8:12 a.m. Efficient. I appreciated that. And their status? She lowered her voice slightly, though there was no reason to. My field representative reported some resistance. The older gentleman insisted there had been a mistake and said he was the owner. I almost smiled. And what was he told? That the property is titled under the Horizon Family Asset Trust, with you listed as sole trustee. The occupants are month-to-month residential tenants. Payment coverage was terminated at your request. They now have 3 days to cure or vacate. Month-to-month tenants. The phrase had such an ordinary sound to it, but those 4 words had the power to collapse an entire illusion. Thank you, I said. Would you like me to email you the delivery photographs and the compliance packet? Yes, and include the county filing references. Of course. When I ended the call, the phone remained in my hand for a moment. I imagined the scene out at the house. Vanessa standing in the front hallway with perfect makeup and rising panic. My husband staring at a bright legal notice taped to the oak front door like a man who had just discovered gravity. The same house where he had brought that woman into my kitchen, poured champagne into crystal glasses I purchased, and spoken about financial freedom as if he had earned it. Now that same front door carried a legal reminder of what he had never understood. Occupation is not ownership. I set the phone down and opened my email. Diane had already sent the packet. There were the photographs, clear, time-stamped, indisputable, the notice taped neatly at eye level, the front porch swept clean, the brass house numbers gleaming beside the door. From the outside, it still looked like the sort of suburban home where respectable people hosted Thanksgiving dinners and waved politely at neighbors. But paper changes things. So do signatures. I read the notice slowly, not because I needed to, but because there was a strange satisfaction in seeing the language formalized. 3 days to pay, or quit. Failure to comply would result in enforcement proceedings. Possession would revert fully to the trust. It was not revenge. It was administration. That distinction mattered to me. Revenge is emotional, sloppy, designed to wound. What I was doing was different. I was restoring order to a system that had been abused. By late morning, my husband called again. This time I answered. "What now?" I said. His breathing was hard and uneven. "There's a notice on the door." "Yes. You had me served." "No," I corrected. "The trust had you served." "You are the trust." "Exactly." Silence. Then, slowly, suspicion. "What are you talking about?" I walked to the window and looked down at the gray ribbon of the Chicago River moving between buildings. "The house isn't in your name," I said. "It never was." For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he laughed. A brittle, angry laugh. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I signed the paperwork. "You signed a residential occupancy agreement." "No." "Yes." "You're lying." This time I did smile. There is something almost sad about a person realizing he has misunderstood his own life. "I'm not." In the background, I heard Vanessa asking questions. "What is she saying? Charles, what is she saying?" He covered the phone and muttered something to her, then came back on the line with anger pouring through every word. "You tricked me." "No. I protected the property. You made me look like a fool." That, more than anything else, told me he understood. Not the trust language, not the legal structure, but the humiliation. And for a man like my husband, humiliation always cut deeper than truth. "I kept a roof over your head for 3 years, I said quietly. "That was not a trick. It was generosity." His voice dropped lower. "You can't throw me out." "I can." "Over some misunderstanding?" I closed my eyes briefly. A misunderstanding, as if the affair, the violence, the attempted theft, the sale of my father's watch, and the fraudulent wire transfer were all just paperwork confusion between reasonable adults. "No," I said. "Not over misunderstanding, over pattern." He didn't respond, because deep down, he knew what I meant. People like my husband always want each offense judged separately. A late night here, a lie there, one shove, one sale, one transfer. But my whole life's work had taught me to look at patterns. And the pattern was clear. Infidelity, theft, fraud, abuse, dependency disguised as entitlement. I opened my eyes and spoke very calmly. "You have 3 days. Use them wisely." Then I ended the call. Outside, the city moved on. Taxis, buses, pedestrians, office workers balancing paper cups of coffee in gloved hands. Life continuing, indifferent and orderly. Inside that suburban house, however, disorder had officially begun, and they still didn't understand the worst part. The notice on the door was not the climax. It was only the beginning. By noon, the first hateful message arrived. It came from a woman I hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years, a distant cousin on my husband's side who only ever called at funerals and holiday potlucks. Her text was short, self-righteous, and exactly what I should have expected. "I can't believe you would do this to an old man." I stared at the screen for a moment, then placed the phone face down on the hotel desk. When you have lived long enough, you begin to understand how quickly people will form opinions when they are handed a dramatic lie wrapped in just enough emotion to feel true. Nobody asks for records. Nobody asks for contracts. Nobody asks who paid what, who signed what, or who bled on the living room rug 2 nights ago. They just pick the story that flatters their instincts. And by lunchtime, I knew exactly who was telling that story. Vanessa. I opened my social media account and found her post within seconds. She had written a long, tearful public statement about watching a decent man be financially abused by a cold, controlling wife. There was even a photograph of my husband standing in the driveway with a tragic expression on his face. The empty spot where the Mercedes had been parked visible over one shoulder like a stage prop. The caption read, "Some women would rather destroy a man than let him be happy." I read the whole thing twice. Then I read the comments. Shame on her. That poor man deserves peace in his final years. Women like that use money as a weapon. I scrolled slowly, not because the words hurt, but because in my line of work, public lies are rarely just insults. They are evidence. Every false accusation, every threat, every public statement implying theft, cruelty, or instability. For most people, social media is noise. For me, it was documentation. I carried my coffee back to the desk, opened my laptop, and began recording the screen. Post by post, comment by comment, I captured everything. Dates, times, names, profile photos, shared reposts, private messages. By 1 o'clock, I had created a digital folder labeled defamation. I knew better than to respond publicly. That is the mistake innocent people often make. They think truth will win if it's spoken loudly enough. But truth is not a shouting match. Truth is a file, a timestamp, a clean chain of evidence. And besides, I had no interest in defending myself to people who never once asked how a 70-year-old retired man could afford a luxury car, a large suburban home, and a young mistress with expensive taste. They liked the story they were being sold. Soon enough, they would meet the invoice. At 1:17, my phone rang again. This time it was my husband's niece, the one married to Jamal Carter. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But instincts matter, and something told me this call might be useful. "Hello?" Her voice came through shaky and breathless. "Aunt Ruth?" I had always hated that form of address from her. Not because she wasn't family, but because she only sounded affectionate when she needed something. "Yes. Can I ask you a question?" "You already are." There was a brief silence. Then she blurted out, "Did Charles really try to move $50,000 yesterday?" I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because silence often makes people reveal more than questions do. "I knew it," she whispered. "Interesting. What exactly do you think you know?" I asked. Another pause. Then more quietly, "Jamal's been acting strange." I walked to the window and looked down at the river again. The sky had gone pale and hard, the kind of gray only Chicago can produce. A tourist boat moved slowly beneath the bridge like a floating afterthought. "Strange how?" "He keeps saying not to panic. He says some accounts are tied up because of an SEC paperwork issue. He told me it's routine, but it doesn't feel routine." There it was. The crack in the performance. I kept my voice neutral. "Why are you calling me?" "Because he and Charles are talking like they're about to come into a lot of money," she said. "And because Vanessa keeps posting things online like this is all some kind of victory." Victory. That word again. It amazes me how often foolish people celebrate too early. "I see. She hesitated. "I wanted to know if something serious is going on." "Something serious." I nearly smiled. Her husband was likely under federal investigation. My husband had attempted a fraudulent transfer, filed false tax documents, and allowed his mistress to publicly defame me online. He had shoved me hard enough to split my skin open and tried to sell my father's watch to fund an affair. Yes, something serious was going on. But people raised in families like his rarely recognize seriousness until handcuffs arrive. "Let me ask you something," I said. "Okay. Have you seen any actual statements? Any proof of Jamal's investment returns? Any registered disclosures? Any audited records?" Silence. "No." "Has he ever shown you where the money goes?" "No." "Then I suggest you start asking better questions." Her breathing shifted. A little faster now. A little less certain. "You think he's lying?" I turned away from the window and walked back toward the desk. "I think men who talk too much about easy money usually are." She said nothing after that. The line stayed open for a few seconds, each of us listening to the other breathe. Then she spoke in a much smaller voice. "Aunt Ruth, if I find out he's done something wrong." She stopped. I finished the thought for her. "Then you'll have to decide whether you want to be a wife or a witness." The line went silent. I ended the call before she could say anything else. Then I sat down, opened a fresh legal pad from my bag, and began writing names. Vanessa, my husband. Jamal Carter, his wife. Property manager. Bank fraud contact. Auction house manager. One of the first things I teach young investigators is that chaos becomes manageable the moment you place it in order. Names, dates, motives, money. Once you do that, emotion loses its power. And that afternoon, I needed order more than comfort. At 3 o'clock, the hotel receptionist called my room. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a delivery here for you." "A delivery?" "Yes, ma'am. A floral arrangement." I almost laughed. "Send it up." 10 minutes later, a young bellman knocked gently and wheeled in a large arrangement of white roses in a crystal vase. There was a card tucked in the center. I opened it. "You didn't have to make things ugly. We could have done this quietly." Charles. White roses. Apology flowers. Funeral flowers. Coward flowers. I stared at them for a moment, then picked up the hotel phone and asked the front desk to donate the arrangement to a nearby nursing home, if policy allowed. The girl at reception sounded surprised. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson." When I hung up, I sat very still in the quiet room. That card told me everything I needed to know. My husband still thought this was negotiable. He still believed a gesture could smooth over fraud, violence, betrayal, theft, and humiliation. He still thought he was dealing with a wounded wife. He had not yet understood that he was dealing with an investigator, and investigators do not negotiate with lies. By late afternoon, the smear campaign had spread farther. More messages, more whispers, more people repeating things they didn't understand. I saved every one of them. Because public humiliation only works when the victim has nothing factual to fight back with. I had facts. And somewhere out in that suburban house, with its legal notice on the front door and its stolen glamour draining by the hour, the people trying to destroy me were making a fatal mistake. They were leaving a trail. The next morning began with rain. Not a dramatic storm, just that cold Chicago drizzle that makes the windows look tired and the whole city seem older than it is. I stood by the hotel window with a cup of black coffee in my hand and watched water slide down the glass in thin silver lines. For the first time in years, I had slept without listening for a door opening after midnight, without wondering what excuse would come home with the smell of whiskey, without bracing myself for lies. Peace, I was beginning to remember, is not always loud. Sometimes it sounds like nothing at all. I had just set my coffee down when the front desk called. "Mrs. Thompson, you've received forwarded mail." Of course. The day before leaving the house, I had filed a temporary premium forwarding request for anything addressed to me. It was the sort of practical measure most people forget in a crisis. I never forget paper trails. I told them to send it up. A young attendant delivered a small stack of envelopes 10 minutes later. Credit card offers, a department store catalog, a charity letter asking for a year-end donation. Ordinary American mail. The kind that piles up quietly while people are busy ruining their own lives. Then I saw the envelope that mattered. White, official, heavy stock. Department of the Treasury. Addressed jointly to me and my husband. I sat down at the desk, set the rest of the mail aside, and opened it carefully. The letter inside came from the Internal Revenue Service. Notice of review and request for supporting documentation. I read the first paragraph once. Then again. By the time I reached the second page, I no longer felt surprised, just tired in a very specific way. My husband had electronically filed a joint federal return 3 months earlier, without my knowledge, using my income records, forging my digital authorization, and claiming over $80,000 in business losses for what the filing described as private consulting and digital investment operations. I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was. Not just infidelity, not just financial theft, tax fraud, federal tax fraud. I leaned back in my chair and let the paper rest in my hands. Over the years, I had worked on enough fraud investigations to know that some people steal because they are desperate, and some steal because they are lazy. But the most dangerous ones are the people who steal because they believe the rules don't apply to them. That was my husband. A man who had spent years dismissing my work as dry and boring, all while using the security my income provided to play pretend with younger women and reckless men. I turned back to the notice. The return had claimed deductions for business development expenses, technology acquisition, and executive travel. I knew exactly what that meant. Restaurant tabs, golf fees, clothing, probably hotel rooms. Very likely Vanessa. And because the IRS had finally asked for documentation, he now had 30 days to prove a fantasy business that did not exist. I set the papers down and reached for my phone. There are moments in life when emotion is a luxury. This was not one of them. I called my tax attorney first. Not because I needed advice, I already knew what needed to happen, but because older women who survive hard things understand the value of layering protection. He answered on the second ring. "Good morning, Ruth. I just received an IRS notice regarding a fraudulent joint filing." His voice changed immediately. "What kind of fraudulent filing?" "The kind that involves forged authorization, fake business losses, and a husband with more confidence than intelligence." A pause. Then, quietly, "How bad?" "Bad enough." I explained the notice in clean, chronological terms. No drama, just facts. By the time I finished, he was typing. "You'll need to file injured spouse relief immediately," he said. "I know." "And a fraud affidavit." "I know." "And I strongly advise you to separate yourself from any related liability before he tries to argue joint benefit." "I'm already doing that." He gave a short exhale that almost sounded like sympathy. "Would you like me to prepare the packet?" "No, I'll draft it myself and send you a copy for review." That made him laugh softly. "Of course you will." We ended the call, and I opened my laptop. Then I began building the firewall. If you've never filed an injured spouse allocation, let me explain it plainly. It is one of the few civilized things in federal tax law. It allows one spouse to prove that the other committed fraud or incurred liability without their knowledge, protecting the innocent party from being dragged down together. I had spent decades teaching junior investigators that documentation saves lives. Now I was documenting my own. W-2 records, payroll statements, prior signed returns, access logs showing the filing history, a sworn statement confirming I had not authorized the return, and then a second affidavit. This one shorter, simpler, and somehow more humiliating to write. My husband filed the return without my knowledge. He forged authorization and misrepresented non-existent business expenses as deductible losses. Every word was true. Every word felt like a tombstone. By noon, I had assembled the packet and sent the digital copies to my attorney for immediate review. I also uploaded a notification through the secure IRS portal flagging the filing as potentially fraudulent and requesting full separation of liability. Then I printed a hard copy for my personal records and slid it into my leather folder. People think justice arrives dramatically. In my experience, it usually arrives as certified mail. At 12:30, my phone rang again. This time it was my husband. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. His voice came through strained and too careful. "There's something wrong with the taxes." I nearly smiled. "Is there?" "We got some letter." "Yes." Silence. He had not expected me to know. "You opened my mail?" "No," I said calmly. "I opened mine." Another pause. Then defensiveness. "It's probably nothing." "No, it's federal." "Don't start." "Start." As if I were the one who had created the problem. "You filed a false return," I said. "I filed what we needed." "You forged my authorization." "I handled it." "That is not the same thing." His breathing turned heavier. Somewhere in the background, I heard a cabinet door slam. Vanessa was probably in the kitchen pretending not to listen. "It was tax strategy," he snapped. "People do this all the time." "No, criminals do this all the time." That shut him up for a moment. Then came the anger. "You always talk to me like I'm stupid." I looked down at the IRS notice still lying on the desk, at the official seal, at the typed deadline, at the clean language of consequence. "No," I said quietly. "You do foolish things, and then you resent being described accurately." He muttered something I couldn't make out. Then, in a lower voice, "Can you fix it?" There it was. Not apology, not shame, need. I had supported this man for so long that even now, with everything collapsing around him, he still thought of me as the one who would come in at the end and clean up the mess. A wife. An accountant. A shield. "No," I said. "You have to." "I don't. This affects you too." "Not for long." That line landed exactly the way I intended it to. I heard him shift, then speak more carefully. "What does that mean?" "It means I've already taken steps to separate myself from what you did." His voice sharpened. "You'd turn your own husband over to the IRS?" I stood up and walked to the window. Rain still moved softly across the city. Cars hissed through wet streets below. A woman in a red scarf hurried under an umbrella toward the crosswalk. Life continuing, as it always does, while one private world falls apart. "You turned yourself over," I said. "I'm just refusing to stand under you when it collapses." He said my name then, not with affection, not with regret, with fear, real fear. And for the first time since the message on my phone, I understood something important. The car had humiliated him. The house had frightened him. But the tax return? That was the thing that finally made him understand he might actually lose. I ended the call without saying goodbye. Then I sat back down, folded the IRS notice neatly, and placed it into the folder with the rest of my evidence. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside that suburban house, however, another kind of weather had begun, and this storm was federal. That afternoon, the rain finally stopped. Chicago has a strange way of resetting itself after a gray morning. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had lifted just enough for a pale winter sun to push through, reflecting softly against the river outside my hotel window. I had just finished organizing the IRS documents when my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't my husband. It wasn't Vanessa. It wasn't anyone from the family. The caller ID displayed a number I recognized immediately. Oak Street Antiques and Estate Auction. The same place that had called 2 days earlier. I answered on the second ring. "This is Ruth Thompson." "Mrs. Thompson," the man said politely. "This is Robert Kellerman from Oak Street Antiques. We spoke earlier this week about a watch." "Yes." His voice carried the careful tone of someone stepping into complicated territory. "I'm calling because the gentleman who brought the watch in returned today." I leaned back slowly in the chair. "My husband. What did he want?" I asked. "He wanted to finalize the sale." "Of course he did." I closed my eyes briefly and pictured the scene. My 70-year-old husband walking into a polished antique showroom with my father's watch in his pocket, standing beneath warm display lighting, explaining confidently that he was ready to complete the transaction. Probably imagining himself surprising Vanessa with the money. Or worse, imagining himself using the money to repair the chaos he had already created. "What did you tell him?" I asked. There was a small pause. "I told him the watch could not be sold." "And how did he respond?" The auctioneer cleared his throat. "He was unhappy." I almost smiled. "That sounds accurate." "He insisted the watch belonged to him." "Did he?" "Yes, ma'am." "And then?" I explained that after our previous conversation, we verified the ownership documentation associated with the piece. "The watch was registered under your insurance records and family estate documentation. Legally speaking, it is clearly yours." The man paused again before continuing. He became quite agitated. I could imagine that too. My husband had always believed that confidence alone could rewrite facts. "Did he leave with the watch?" I asked. "No." My eyes opened. "No?" "No, ma'am. The watch remained with us for appraisal after he first brought it in. He had signed temporary custody paperwork pending verification." "That was interesting." "Very interesting." "And where is it now?" "In our secured storage vault." For the first time that day, something like genuine relief moved through me. My father's watch was safe. 35 years in financial investigations teaches you not to celebrate too early, but some things still matter. "Mr. Deppin." "Kellerman," I said calmly, "I appreciate your professionalism." "Of course. I will retrieve the watch personally this week." "That would be advisable." Another small pause. "There is something else you should know," he added. "Yes?" When the gentleman realized the sale would not proceed, he attempted to offer it privately to another customer in the showroom. That made me sit up straighter. "He tried to sell it in the store?" "Yes." "What happened?" "Security escorted him out." I let out a slow breath. My husband had just tried to illegally sell a watch he did not own inside an auction house in front of witnesses. Not exactly subtle behavior. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," I said. "We see unusual situations from time to time," the man replied diplomatically, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. Older professionals recognize the difference between drama and documentation. This situation had just created another record, another witness, another piece of evidence. Before ending the call, I asked one final question. "Did he say why he needed the money?" Mr. Kellerman hesitated. Then he answered carefully. He mentioned needing to make an investment payment today. Investment. The word again. Jamal Carter. Crypto pools. Impossible returns. And now a watch that couldn't be sold. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat quietly for a few minutes, letting the silence settle around the room. There are moments in life when a pattern becomes so clear that the outcome is almost inevitable. My husband had tried to move $50,000 into a questionable crypto scheme. When that failed, he attempted to sell my father's watch. When that failed, he called me asking for help fixing tax fraud. Now the IRS was involved. The house had a legal eviction notice on the door. The car was gone. And the woman he had chosen over me was busy broadcasting lies on social media. All the pieces were in motion now. People often believe that financial collapse happens suddenly. It doesn't. Collapse begins quietly. One transaction. One lie. One document. Then the structure starts to lean. And suddenly everyone realizes they have been standing inside something fragile. At 5 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from Vanessa. "You think you're winning, don't you?" I stared at the message. Then another one arrived. "Charles says you're trying to destroy him." I typed a reply slowly. "No, I'm simply no longer protecting him." The typing indicator appeared immediately. "You're bitter." I didn't respond. Instead, I placed the phone down and returned to my folder of documents. Because bitterness is loud. What I was doing required patience. And patience always outlasts noise. Outside the window, Chicago's skyline had begun glowing again as evening lights came on across the city. Somewhere in the suburbs, my husband was probably pacing the living room, trying to explain to Vanessa why the watch couldn't be sold, why the car was gone, why the house had legal papers on the door, and why the IRS now wanted answers. And somewhere else in the city, Jamal Carter was likely making frantic phone calls of his own, because the kind of scheme he was running depends on one thing above all else: constant money, fresh money. And today, one very important transfer had failed. I closed the folder and stood up. The investigation I had begun almost by accident was no longer just about my marriage. It was about a pattern of fraud spreading through people who believed no one was watching. But someone was. The call came just after 7 that evening. I had been sitting in the hotel lounge downstairs, finishing a quiet dinner of grilled salmon and steamed vegetables while reading through the final documents from the IRS packet. The restaurant lighting was warm and low, the kind of place where business travelers eat without speaking much to each other. My phone vibrated against the table. The caller ID showed a number from the suburban police department. For a moment, I simply watched it ring. Then I answered. "This is Ruth Thompson." A calm male voice responded. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Officer Delgado with the Northbrook Police Department. I'm calling regarding a disturbance report connected to your former residence." Former residence. The phrasing caught my attention immediately. "Yes," I said. "We received a call this afternoon from the management company handling the property. They informed us that eviction paperwork had been served and that tensions at the residence were escalating." "That sounds accurate." The officer paused briefly before continuing. "Your husband appeared at a residential address listed under your name earlier this afternoon, an apartment in downtown Chicago. My new address." I felt my shoulders stiffen slightly. "Yes. He attempted to gain entry to the building." "Of course he did." "What happened?" "Security refused him access. According to building staff, he became verbally aggressive and refused to leave the lobby area." I closed my eyes for a moment. 43 years of marriage had taught me something about my husband that no investigation ever could. When he feels cornered, he gets louder. "He demanded to speak with you," the officer continued. "I'm sure he did. Security informed him you were not present and asked him to leave the property. And he didn't." "No, ma'am." I leaned back in the chair. "What happened next?" "He attempted to push past the security desk." There it was. The same impatience. The same entitlement. The same careless assumption that rules were meant for other people. "He was warned twice," the officer said calmly. "When he refused to leave, officers were dispatched. And now? He has been taken into custody for trespassing and disorderly conduct." For a moment I said nothing, not because I was shocked, but because a strange feeling had just settled into my chest. "Finality," the officer continued speaking. "We will likely release him later tonight once he posts bond. However, building management has requested that a formal trespass notice be issued." "That's appropriate. Do you wish to pursue a restraining order? The question lingered between us for several seconds. 20 years earlier, I would have said no immediately. 10 years earlier, I might have hesitated. But tonight I answered clearly. Yes. Understood. The officer took down a few details and gave me instructions on filing the paperwork the following morning. When the call ended, the quiet restaurant seemed even quieter than before. A waiter passed by carrying a tray of desserts. Someone at the bar laughed softly at a joke I couldn't hear. Life continuing. Always continuing. I returned to my room slowly and placed my phone on the desk. 10 minutes later, it vibrated again. This time, the call came from Vanessa. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. What? I answered. Her voice came through sharp with panic. What did you do? Excuse me. They arrested him. Yes. You called the police? No. Don't lie to me. I walked over to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline, glowing against the night sky. I didn't need to call anyone, I said calmly. He did that himself. You set him up. No. You ruined everything. That sentence made me pause. Ruined everything. Not the marriage. Not the trust. Everything. Which meant she understood something now. The money. Jamal. The investment. Is Jamal with you? I asked. She hesitated. Then snapped. That's none of your business. Interesting. Tell him something for me. Silence. Tell him the Securities and Exchange Commission tends to take an interest in companies that promise impossible investment returns. The silence on the other end deepened. What are you talking about? You'll find out. You're bluffing. I rarely bluff. Her breathing had changed now. Faster. Less confident. Charles says you're trying to destroy him, she said. I'm documenting him. You think you're better than everyone. No. You think because you're old and bitter, you can control everything. I almost smiled. Age again. As if the number 68 meant weakness instead of experience. You should go to sleep, I said. Why? Because tomorrow is going to be a long day. I ended the call before she could respond. Then I sat down at the desk and opened my laptop. The folder labeled Evidence had grown steadily over the last 48 hours. Fraud alerts. Wire transfer records. IRS documentation. Screenshots of Vanessa's accusations. Witnesses from the auction house. Property management filings. And now, a police report. Trespassing. Disorderly conduct. My husband had spent his entire life believing consequences were something that happened to other people. Tonight, he was sitting in a holding cell learning otherwise. Outside my window, Chicago pulsed quietly with night traffic and distant sirens. For the first time since the message arrived on my phone, I felt something close to certainty. The house was slipping away from him. The car was gone. The tax fraud was exposed. And Jamal Carter's investment empire was beginning to look suspiciously fragile. The structure that had supported their little celebration was cracking piece by piece, and none of them understood the most dangerous part yet. Because while they were panicking, I was still investigating. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse just after 8. Cook County courts have a particular kind of atmosphere in the morning. Metal detectors, wet footprints on stone floors from people shaking off winter rain, lawyers carrying leather briefcases and paper cups of coffee, tired women in sensible shoes, men in wrinkled jackets trying to look more respectable than they felt. America has 1,000 public rooms where consequences are processed quietly. A courthouse is one of them. I wore a navy wool suit and low black heels. My bandage was gone, but the bruise at my forehead had darkened enough that no amount of powder could hide it completely. I didn't try. Some marks deserved to be seen. I wasn't there for my husband's trespassing hearing. That would be handled by a duty judge and a public defender if he couldn't arrange private counsel. I was there to file for a protective order and to put one more piece of formal distance between my life and his chaos. Distance. That word had become almost sacred to me. You spend long enough in a marriage where your money, your patience, and your dignity are treated like communal property, and eventually you begin to understand that distance isn't cruelty. It's medicine. The clerk at the domestic relations counter looked to be in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled into a neat twist and reading glasses low on her nose. She greeted me with the kind of tired kindness that only comes from years of seeing women arrive at the same window carrying the wreckage of their private lives in manila folders. Good morning. Good morning, I said. How can I help you? I need to file for an order of protection." Her eyes lifted briefly to my face, taking in the bruise, the calm tone, the folder in my hand. "All right," she said gently. "Do you already have the forms?" "I filled them out online last night." "Good." She extended her hand, and I passed over the paperwork. There is something deeply American about filling out forms for your own salvation. Boxes to check, dates to enter, incidents to summarize in a handful of lines too small for the truth they are meant to contain. Physical shove resulting in injury. Repeated verbal abuse. Financial coercion. Harassing contact. Unauthorized attempt to force entry into current residence. So much harm reduced to clean black print. The clerk reviewed the pages carefully, stamped 2 copies, and handed one back to me. "You'll be called shortly." I thanked her and moved to the waiting area. The benches were half full. A mother with a stroller and a sleeping baby. A young man tapping his foot so hard it shook the floor beneath him. An elderly woman in a church hat staring at nothing, her handbag folded tightly in both hands. I sat at the far end near the window and placed my folder on my lap. For a few minutes, I let myself just breathe. There was a time in my life when sitting in a courthouse like that would have felt like failure. Women of my generation were raised on 1,000 quiet instructions about endurance. Keep the family together. Don't air private business in public. Pray on it. Be patient. Men have their ways. Marriage is work. And marriage is work. But so is survival. At 68, I no longer confuse the two. My phone buzzed once. A text from my husband. "Please don't do this." I looked at the screen without emotion. Then I saved a screenshot, placed the phone back in my purse, and waited. No reply. No explanation. Just evidence. About 10 minutes later, another message arrived. I was upset. I didn't mean any of it. Again, I took a screenshot. People like my husband always become fluent in regret once the law is involved. It's never remorse first, never conscience, just inconvenience. At 8:47, a courtroom deputy opened the door and called my name. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and followed him inside. The room was smaller than most people imagine when they think of court. No dramatic wood-paneled grandeur. Just fluorescent lights, a state flag in one corner, the judge's bench raised slightly above the rest of us, and rows of seats worn smooth by years of waiting. The judge was a woman, perhaps a few years younger than I was, with careful eyes and the posture of someone who had long ago learned how to hear pain without getting lost in it. She reviewed the petition silently for a few moments. Then she looked up at me. "Mrs. Thompson, is everything in this filing accurate to the best of your knowledge?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And are you requesting temporary emergency protection based on the recent physical incident and the subsequent trespass at your new residence?" "I am." She nodded once. "Tell me briefly what happened." Briefly. Another American miracle. A 43-year marriage compressed into minutes. "My husband came home intoxicated 2 nights before I left our residence," I said. "He had lipstick on his collar. When I confronted him, he became verbally abusive and shoved me. I fell and struck my head on a coffee table." The judge's expression did not change, but her pen moved. "After I left the property, he attempted to transfer $50,000 from our joint account without authorization. When I cut off household payments and left, he later went to my current residence, refused to leave, and attempted to force entry past building security. He was arrested for trespassing." "Has he continued contacting you?" "Yes." I handed the deputy printed copies of the text messages. The judge reviewed them, then looked back at me. "Do you fear further harassment?" "I believe he is becoming more desperate, not less." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she signed the order. Just like that. No speech, no dramatic pause. Just the movement of a pen and the authority of law landing where my own private boundaries had failed to hold. "A temporary protective order is granted," she said. "No contact except through counsel. No approach to the petitioner's residence or workplace. Service will be arranged." I thanked the court and stepped back. That should have been the emotional moment. But what I felt most strongly was not triumph. It was steadiness. A form of internal quiet I had not felt in years. Outside the courtroom, the deputy handed me the stamped copy. "Take care of yourself, ma'am." "I intend to." When I walked back into the hallway, the courthouse seemed louder than before. More footsteps, more voices, more lives colliding with law. I stepped aside near a long window overlooking the street and opened my folder again. Protective order, IRS documentation, property notice, wire transfer report, auction house note, defamation records. It was all there now. A paper architecture of truth. My husband and the people orbiting him still believed they were fighting a marriage problem. They were wrong. This had become something else. A legal problem, a financial problem, a credibility problem. And the worst part for them was that every hour they spent lying, blaming, posting, and panicking only deepened the record against them. My phone buzzed again. This time it was not my husband. It was a text from his niece. He's out. Jamal's here too. They keep saying they can fix everything before Thanksgiving. I stared at the message for a moment. Before Thanksgiving. So that was the deadline they had chosen in their minds. Not 3 days. Not court. Not taxes. Not arrests. Thanksgiving. The perfect family holiday for denial. I typed a single reply. Let them try. Then I slipped the phone back into my purse and walked out into the cold Chicago morning, where the wind off the lake cut sharp across the courthouse steps and people moved quickly with collars turned up against the weather. My husband was out of custody. Jamal was back at his side. And somewhere in that suburban house, they were still making plans. That suited me just fine. Because people are easiest to expose when they're convinced they still have time. By the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, I knew exactly how desperate they had become. Desperation changes the rhythm of people. The calls come faster, the lies grow sloppier, pride begins slipping through the cracks, and fear starts speaking through the parts of a person that used to sound arrogant. My husband had stopped sending long messages and started sending short ones. Can we talk? Please answer. This has gone too far. Vanessa, meanwhile, had gone silent online. That told me more than any public post ever could. People disappear from social media for one of two reasons. Either they are ashamed or they are planning something. In her case, I suspected both. That same afternoon, I received an email from Diane at the property management company confirming what I had already expected. The 3-day notice period would officially expire on Thanksgiving Day. Because of the holiday schedule, the county sheriff's office had agreed to execute the lockout that evening at 6 o'clock sharp. I read the email twice, then closed my laptop. The timing was almost too perfect. Thanksgiving had always been my husband's favorite holiday. He liked the performance of it. The carved turkey, the polished serving dishes, the football game playing low in the background while he poured bourbon and talked too loudly about things he barely understood. For years I had cooked those dinners, brined the turkey, ironed the linen napkins, polished the silver that had belonged to my mother, fed people who mistook my labor for tradition and my silence for peace. This year, I decided Thanksgiving would still be memorable, just not for the reasons they expected. I sent one text. We can settle everything on Thanksgiving. I'll come to the house at 4. We'll end this quietly. The response came 3 minutes later. Good. Bring the deed paperwork and the bank transfer authorization. I stared at the screen for a moment and almost laughed. Not grief. Not nostalgia. Just the exhausted amusement of a woman watching fools mistake a trap for a victory lap. On Thanksgiving morning, Chicago woke under a sky the color of old pewter. A hard wind came off the lake, and by afternoon there were flurries in the air, thin and sharp as torn paper. I got dressed slowly. Black slacks, a cream silk blouse, a long dark coat, pearl earrings. No bright colors, no dramatic entrance. I wasn't going there as a wronged wife or a grieving woman. I was going there as a witness. My leather briefcase held everything I needed. The IRS notice, the fraud alert records, the wire transfer details, the property trust documents, printouts of Vanessa's smear campaign, the auction house summary regarding my father's watch, and one more item, a copy of the email Vanessa had sent 2 nights earlier from my husband's account, demanding that I restore access to the house, return the car, and transfer funds if I wanted the contents of my old laptop to remain private. That had been her mistake. She thought she had discovered something valuable when she found an old, decommissioned laptop in the hall closet. In reality, what she found was a decoy archive I had once used in an internal cybersecurity training seminar, fabricated financial records, fake offshore ledgers, dummy client files. It looked incriminating to the untrained eye. And she had put her threat in writing. People like Vanessa always imagine themselves clever, right up until their words become evidence. At 4:15, I pulled into the driveway of the house. Cars lined both sides of the street. Family had gathered. From the outside, everything looked exactly the way it always had on Thanksgiving. Warm lights glowing through the windows, a wreath on the door, the smell of roasted turkey and sage stuffing drifting faintly through the cold. A holiday postcard, a lie with side dishes. I parked, stepped out into the freezing air, and carried my briefcase to the front door. I didn't knock. I opened it and walked in. Conversation stopped immediately. The dining room table had been set with my good china, my serving dishes, my candlesticks. Even the hand-embroidered table runner my mother made in 1972 lay stretched beneath the platters. For one sharp second, anger moved through me so cleanly it almost felt like clarity. Vanessa stood at the far end of the table in a wine-colored dress, smiling with the confidence of a woman who still believed she had leverage. My husband sat at the head of the table, one hand wrapped around a glass of bourbon, trying to look composed. Jamal stood near the sideboard, too carefully relaxed. His wife sat in silence beside him, pale and hollow-eyed. No one said welcome. That, at least, was honest. My husband broke the silence first. "You're late." "Traffic." He nodded toward an empty chair. "Sit down." I remained standing. "No." Vanessa crossed her arms. "Let's not waste time." "I agree." I set the briefcase on the table, directly beside the untouched plate they had laid out for me. My husband reached into a folder near his elbow and slid several pages across the table. "There," he said. "The transfer authorization. Sign it. Then the deed papers." I looked down. The documents were laughable, badly formatted, legally clumsy, full of the kind of language men use when they've downloaded templates online and convinced themselves they understand contracts. Jamal cleared his throat. "It's straightforward." I raised my eyes to his face. "No, it's fraudulent." The room went quiet again. Vanessa's smile faltered. "We have your laptop," she said sharply. "You know what's on it." "Yes," I said. "I do." She straightened, mistaking my calm for fear. "Then sign." Instead, I opened my briefcase. Not for a pen, for documents. I took out the trust paperwork first and placed it in front of my husband. "You don't own this house," I said. Then I placed the fraud report in front of Jamal. The $50,000 wire never cleared. Then the IRS notice. The federal return was fraudulent. Then the printouts of Vanessa's email. "And this," I said, sliding it toward her, "is extortion." Nobody moved. My husband looked at the trust papers as though the words might rearrange themselves if he stared hard enough. Jamal's face went gray. Vanessa picked up the email printout with a trembling hand, read the header, and looked at me with the first genuine fear I had seen in her. My husband stood abruptly. "What is this?" "It's the truth." "You're trying to humiliate me on Thanksgiving?" "No," I said quietly. "You did that to yourself." Then I glanced toward the foyer. The front door had remained slightly open behind me. Right on cue, two people stepped inside. A woman in a dark wool coat from the SEC. A man beside her carrying credentials from the FBI Cyber Division. The room didn't explode. It collapsed. That is the difference between drama and reality. Drama shouts. Reality takes the air out of everything. The agent spoke first, calm and direct. "Vanessa Morgan?" She went pale. "Yes?" "We need to discuss the email you transmitted, attempting to coerce financial gain through threats involving protected digital materials." She looked at my husband as if he might save her. He couldn't even save himself. The SEC investigator turned to Jamal. "And we need to discuss Apex Digital Assets." His wife made a small sound, then not quite a sob, not quite a gasp. More like the noise a person makes when denial finally leaves the body. My husband was still standing, gripping the back of his chair. "This is insane." No one answered him. At exactly 6 o'clock, as if the evening had been scheduled by a playwright with a cruel sense of timing, the lights in the house went out. The dining room fell into darkness, broken only by the sweep of red and blue flashing through the front windows. Then came the knock. Heavy, official, county sheriff. When the deputies entered, their flashlights cut across the crystal glasses and silver serving bowls, catching the abandoned turkey in a wash of white light. The lead deputy spoke clearly. Eviction order has expired. Occupants have 5 minutes to collect medication, wallets, identification, and coats. Everything else remains. Vanessa began crying. My husband didn't. He just stood there, staring at me like a man looking at a stranger who had once been his wife. Maybe I was. Outside, snow had started falling in earnest by the time they were escorted onto the front walk. The locksmith changed the deadbolt while the deputies watched. Jamal was led to a separate vehicle. Vanessa stood shivering beside the porch, mascara streaking down her face. My husband, coatless until a deputy handed it to him, looked suddenly every bit his 70 years. Old, cold, and, for the first time, honest. When he stepped toward me, one deputy moved subtly between us. "Ruth," he said, and the sound of my name in his mouth felt smaller than it ever had before. "Please." I looked at him, at the snow settling on his shoulders, at the house behind him, locked at last, at the woman beside him who had sent the message that began all of this. Then I remembered the words glowing on my phone. "Pack your things and get out of our lives." So I gave him the only answer left. "I'm just honoring your request." I turned, walked to the car service waiting at the curb, and got inside. As we pulled away, I looked back once. The man I had spent 43 years trying to keep comfortable stood in the snow beside the young woman he had chosen over peace, dignity, and sense. Behind them, the house was dark, locked, silent. 6 months later, the divorce was final. The IRS assigned every fraudulent liability where it belonged. Jamal was indicted. Vanessa disappeared before spring. My husband took a warehouse job on the night shift and moved into a furnished rental on the industrial edge of the city. And me? I kept the watch. I kept my name. And I kept my peace. Because in the end, justice did not arrive with shouting. It arrived with documents, deadlines, and a locked front door. The story of Ruth Thompson teaches a powerful lesson about dignity, truth, and quiet justice. For many years, Ruth endured disrespect, betrayal, and manipulation in silence, believing that patience and loyalty would preserve her marriage. But when the truth finally surfaced, she chose something many people fear she chose: to stand up for herself. Instead of reacting with anger or revenge, she relied on wisdom, evidence, and the strength she had built over a lifetime. The lesson is simple but profound. When someone takes your kindness for weakness, the most powerful response is not rage, but clarity and boundaries. In the end, integrity, patience, and truth have a way of exposing deception and restoring dignity to those who refuse to surrender it.